Chapter 12. She was out in the cold black night again, and now there was no spot of light ahead to give her courage to push on. Everything had gone wrong today, over and over again. She was so miserable she wanted to sink down in the snow and go to sleep. She heard some horsemen come galloping down the road and quickly dodged out of the way. She could not see them as they disappeared in the dark, but she could hear them round a bend in the road ahead and then suddenly stop. Far away she heard a burst of laughter as if a door had been opened and closed again. That might be the tavern. It was almost too much to hope for, but it made sense. It might be the tavern. When she came to the bend, she saw a group of horses tied to a long hitching post. A light from a small lantern in a window shone on a sign over the doorway. It was the picture of a smiling fox. The Jolly Fox Tavern at last! She had found it. Ellen pushed open the door and stumbled into a room that seemed to be bouncing with laughter and singing. It smelled of hot food and old ale and muddy boots. Candles on the tables and a crackling fire in a huge fireplace made the room aglow. Sprawled on chairs around the long tables were many red-coated officers. They smoked their white pipes, banged their mugs on the bare boards, and joked with two nimble waitresses in white caps and long green aprons. Beside the fireplace at the far end of the room, Ellen saw a bar with slats of wood from counter to ceiling. She had never been in a tavern before and had never seen a little room like this. It looked like a cage. The shelves at the back were filled with wine bottles and mugs and pewter tankards. White clay tobacco pipes hung from the rafters overhead, waiting to be borrowed by the customers. Inside the cage, a plump little woman was drawing ale from a keg into a row of mugs. She, too, wore a long green apron, and in her ears were gold earrings that sparkled when she turned her head in time to the tune she was whistling. A small British flag was stuck jauntily in her white topknot. "Is this Mistress Shannon?" Ellen wondered. She ran up to her and asked cautiously, "May I speak to Mr. Shannon?" The little white-haired woman pushed 4 mugs along the counter and called to a waitress. "Don't keep the gentleman waiting." Then she turned to Ellen. "What's your pleasure, sir?" She threw back her head and started to laugh. "You're about as small as they come," she chuckled. "May I see Mr. Shannon?" Ellen asked again. She was impatient because the woman was so slow. Now that she was here, she wanted to thrust the bread into Mr. Shannon's hands. Who was this woman with the British flag and her white hair? The woman started singing in a loud voice as she wiped her hands on the towel at her waist. Her eyes darted quickly about the room as she leaned forward and put her head through the gateway of her cage. "Mr. Shannon's not here," she said. "Not here?" Ellen was filled with dismay. "He has gone to the country to find a few kegs of ale." "Gone?" cried Ellen in a voice that was sharp and frightened. What did she mean, gone? Grandfather said he would be here, waiting for her. "When will he be back?" she asked desperately. The woman was banging mugs on the counter and making a great clatter with some dishes. "In a day or two, no telling when." She seemed to be looking past Ellen at the soldiers in the room. "I have come a long way," Ellen began, but the woman's loud singing drowned out her words. When she could interrupt her, Ellen pleaded, "And I must find him. Now, can you help me?" "He's gone to the country," the woman said again in a very loud voice, "to find some more ale for these thirsty men. No telling which way he went." Then she leaned across the counter and whispered, "Just sit by the fire, boy." Her face was filled with friendly concern. "Just close your eyes and don't talk to anyone at all. I'm Mr. Shannon's wife." And with that she went back to the keg of ale, picking up the song the soldiers were singing and shouting it as lustily as they. The little flag fluttered with each toss of her head. Ellen wanted to give Mr. Shannon the loaf of bread and be done with it, but she remembered her grandfather's warning, Give the bread to no one but Mr. Shannon. Two redcoats moved their outstretched legs to make way for her as she stumbled over to the fire and sat down on a low stool. On a spit before the fire, a roast of mutton was sizzling and sputtering, but not even the smell of a good hot roast made her hungry. She was too tired and upset and numb with shock. As she watched the leaping flames, her head whirled with memories of the day. They went past her eyes in a dizzy parade. The boat full of soldiers, the crowded streets of Amboy, the woods, that awful pig. And for what? For nothing. Mr. Shannon wasn't here. All that she had endured meant nothing in the end. She could sit here and wait all she liked. Mr. Shannon wouldn't be back for 2 days. Angrily, she kicked off her wet shoes and shoved them toward the fire. She leaned forward, doubling up over the loaf of bread inside her jacket, put her head on her knees, and let her arms flop down. She was too tired to move. The noise of the tavern swirled about her, but Ellen barely heard it. Before long, she felt a tap on her shoulder and saw the woman with the flag in her hair beckoning to her. Very slowly, she got up. I don't think she's really Mistress Shannon. She's too friendly with the redcoats, Ellen said to herself. But she hugged the loaf of bread under her jacket and followed her, just the same. They passed the bar and quietly slipped into a room at the back. The woman locked the door behind them. It was a small room, lighted only by a fire of pine knots, and rather crowded with a large bed in one corner and 2 big chairs by the fireplace. The heavy red curtains at the windows were tightly drawn. In the dim light, Ellen saw a man rise from one of the chairs. To her surprise, she recognized the tall man in the fur hat and the plaid muffler. His eyes were grave as he pulled the muffler from his long chin. You're a quick one, he said. You ran away too fast. When he unwound the muffler and took off his hat, his thick white hair fell to his shoulders. Ellen liked his face now that she could see it clearly. It was a strong face with a good wide mouth and ruddy cheeks. She remembered his eyes under his white eyebrows. They had seemed to bore through her jacket in the blacksmith shop, but now they were smiling. He was so tall and rugged, he made her think of a great oak tree in the woods. This is Mr. Shannon, whispered the woman. He has come back sooner than I expected. Was he really Mr. Shannon? Ellen wondered. How could she be sure? She thought Mr. Shannon would be a round and jolly innkeeper in a long green apron. She thought he might look like her grandfather since they were good friends. And why would Mr. Shannon go after ale for the soldiers if he were expecting an important message? And that woman who said she was his wife was wearing a little British flag in her hair. It was rather odd. Is that a loaf of bread you are hiding in your jacket? Mr. Shannon said. Yes, Ellen answered slowly. Is it a present for my birthday? Yes, it is, she cried in surprise. From Van Horn, the barber in New York? Now she was sure. Only Mr. Shannon would know about her grandfather. Here it is, Mr. Shannon, she said eagerly as she slipped the loaf of bread from her jacket. Standing there in her stocking feet, she curtsied as she handed him the bread and said the words she had carried in her mind all day. I have brought you a present for your birthday. Then she added, my grandfather hurt his ankle this morning and he couldn't walk at all, so he sent me. As she gave the loaf of bread to Mr. Shannon, she felt as if a great load had been lifted from her shoulders. She had delivered grandfather's message. In spite of everything, she had delivered the message. Her face was beaming. But how did you get here from New York? Mr. Shannon looked puzzled. You were walking, weren't you, when you came into the smithy? I had to walk part of the way, Ellen told him. Not from Amboy, he exclaimed. You couldn't have walked from Amboy. Oh, I got a ride part way with Mr. Murdoch, most of the way. He was going to ride me all of the way, but... Mr. Shannon interrupted her. How in the world did you get to Amboy?" "On a British boat. A soldier—" "On a British boat?" He stared at her in disbelief. "It was because some boy stole my bread in New York and made me late, so I missed the farmers' boats." "But how did you get on a British boat?" "Oh, a man grabbed me. He wanted my loaf of bread." Mr. Shannon stared at her in amazement. "And you worked your way through all those troubles to get the bread here to me? Well, we're very grateful to you, son." Ellen looked up at this very tall man who had charge of relaying the message to the night-riding couriers. He was smiling at her. She felt like telling him that she really had been scared all the time, but a man like Mr. Shannon wouldn't understand about being afraid. "I'd like to stay and have supper with you," he said, "but people are waiting to take this message on its way. 3 different couriers will carry it across New Jersey and deliver it tomorrow. So I must hurry to give it to the first man who lives not far from here." As he tied the bread in his own blue kerchief, he said, "Lucky it was that my horse threw a shoe when I started out to look for your grandfather. I got to thinking about you there in the smithy, and I decided I better come back to see if you stopped here." Mr. Shannon hugged his arm to her cheek and opened the door to the dark night. A cold gust of wind made her skirts billow out. "Be very cautious," she said with concern. "There are redcoats everywhere." After she had bolted the door, she hurried to the hearth and poked at the fire until it blazed up enough to brighten the room. She pulled